Greetings, YouTube. This is going to be an extremely geeky, nerdy video that deals with a very narrow aspect of fantasy role-playing games. So if you have no interest in this topic, stop now, save yourself some time, move on. I'm going to discuss weapons, particularly weapon weights in fantasy role-playing games. And in a very tight focus, the genre that falls under the category of Dungeons and Dragons. Essentially, all of the versions of that game and those games that are in the fantasy genre that fall under the OGL 3.5 open game license. And very appropriately, I am wearing a green Arrow t-shirt. Now, I've been playing the D&D game since 1978. And in all that time, every single version of the rules I have ever read, and in all iterations of the official products based on those rules that I've held in my hands and have called themselves either D&D or a version thereof, the weapon weights have always been abysmally wrong. They're always far, far too heavy. One of my favorite examples is the two-handed sword. You could also refer to it as a Zweelander, which is another term for that. There is a man here in the United States. His name's Tom Maringer. He is possibly one of the greatest living swordsmen. Sword maker, I should say. And, in fact, he stopped taking orders for custom weapons because his backlog is so long, he's going to take him 3 or more years to get caught up. So basically, he does pieces now when he feels like doing them. And it's his opinion, and I'm basing this on the opinion of a man who has made his life's work to create the perfect blade, that a two-handed sword will never weigh more than 6 pounds. Now, some people are going to argue that he is working with modern materials, and you are correct, he is. The best available modern materials. But the best available period materials, somewhere between 6 to 8 to 900 years ago, would have differed between modern materials in degrees not measured in pounds, but measured in ounces. So we are talking about that maybe a period two-handed sword might have weighed almost 7 pounds, slightly heavier than what we have today. Now, a lot of the swords that we see on the walls of museums and in castles and stuff are much larger. Those are so big, and the reason they survive so well is that they were never meant for combat. They are called bearing swords. They were meant as showpieces, things that were carried in parades or just hung on the wall to impress the crap out of anyone who's come to see the local lord, duke, king, what have you. Maybe even gifts from a king to a loyal vassal. In fact, Mr. Maringer actually had someone order a sword from him once, and the person said he wanted a sword that was 1 1/4 inch thick. Now, Mr. Maringer, being a smart swordsmith, said, "Oh, you mean 1 1/4 inch wide?" He said, "No, 1 1/4 inch thick." He wanted a blade that thick, which would have been essentially a 4-foot crowbar and not a sword at all. Mr. Maringer decided not to take this man's order. And you find this issue throughout melee weapons in fantasy games. Now, I read a book recently, and I'm not going to pick on it because it's a very good book, and I don't want to pick on the people who wrote it because they really meant well. But they were following in the footsteps of a long series of mistakes. And in it, they made the same mistakes as everybody else, putting down weights of like 12, 15, even for a Zweelander, 25 pounds. Now, there's no way anyone picked up a 25-pound sword and ever swung it. It just isn't going to happen. Now, they also covered black powder weapons. And this is where things got interesting for me. Because the black powder weapons listed in the book are right. They're within ounces of what an actual black powder weapon of the category described, musket, pistol, boarding pistol, pocket pistol, would actually be in the real world. And the reason behind this is that these people have held these firearms. You can go to places here in New Hampshire and get your hands on replica pieces. You can go to the local gun store and buy black powder versions of muzzleloaders from the 18th and 19th century. And they're going to weigh almost exactly the same as they did from the originals. It's harder to go find two-handed swords that are usable. They're a rarity. They're not common parlance. But I know people are going to say, oh, well, Tetsubo, you're being pedantic. You're being far too detailed and you're being nitpicking, and you are correct. I am. But I've been studying weapons for 30 years. I sketch them as a hobby. They are a pervading presence in my life. And after I read the same set of rules in 5, 6 different versions, and they still get it wrong, it drives me nuts. And some people will say, well, it has to factor in encumbrance. They never call it encumbrance, folks. They call it weight. They've had 30 plus years to get it right and say, this is weight plus encumbrance, which would still be strange because no other equipment in the game has weight plus encumbrance. These things are listed as weight, so I'm taking them as at their word that they're listing weight. And the weights are always incredibly wrong. Now, anyone who is still listening to this, thank you for your time. I know that I'm ranting here, and I apologize. But this is an issue that's important to me. Something that's always bothered me. Which is why I'm going to call it a rant. Because it really doesn't have to do with a review or anything else. It's just me spouting off about something that just drives me batty.